I was 3 days out from the Calder Reach Depot, hauling reactor coolant and seed stock nobody was in a hurry for, when my scanner flagged something it didn't have a category for. It wasn't traffic, it wasn't a beacon buoy, wasn't a nav marker, wasn't any of the 40-some signatures my ship's old library knew how to name. It was just a shape, a slow, patient pulse, the kind of thing you only build when you expect to be listening for a very long time. I almost logged it as instrument drift and kept my course. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe because the pulse had a rhythm to it that didn't feel like noise. Noise doesn't wait for you to notice it's polite. I pulled the freighter off the lane and ran a tighter scan. The signal sharpened the closer I got, the way old things do when you finally point something good at them. By the time I had a fix, I could see it wasn't a buoy at all. It was a hull. Long, dark, drifting with no drive wash and no running lights, tumbling so slow it looked almost deliberate, like it had decided, a long time ago, to stop trying. I should have logged the coordinates and called it in to someone with the authority to decide whether it mattered. That's the correct procedure. I've trained crews on the correct procedure. Instead, I matched velocity, ran a hull integrity check that came back ugly, and took the shuttle over myself. Because something about that patient little pulse had gotten under my skin, and I wasn't going to be able to sleep through 3 more days of hauling coolant without knowing what it had been trying to say. The airlock cycled on stale air, and a smell like burnt insulation gone cold. The corridor lights were down to 1 band in 3, the kind of failing amber you get when a ship has been running on its last reserve for longer than any reserve is built to last. I followed the strongest part of the signal forward, through a hull that groaned every time gravity shifted under my boots, until I came out onto what had to be the command deck. He was sitting at a console that had stopped doing anything useful a long time before I arrived, wrapped in a thermal blanket gone gray with wear, and for a moment, I thought he was already dead. Then his head turned. Slow, deliberate. The way you move when moving costs you something you don't have much of left. He didn't ask who I was. He asked what flag I flew. I told him I didn't fly one. Independent contractor, registered out of a depot he'd never heard of, hauling freight nobody important needed urgently. He looked at me for a long moment, with eyes that had the particular flatness of a man who had run out of being surprised by anything a long time ago. And then he said, in a voice scraped down to almost nothing, that I wasn't supposed to be the one who answered. His name was Vex Orin. He'd been convoy command, once, for a relief fleet that had been running supplies and refugees out ahead of a collapse he didn't waste my time explaining. I gathered enough to understand. It had been bad, and total, and a long time ago. The beacon, he told me, had been built to reach the Concorde relay chain, a network of listening posts his empire had strung across a dozen systems to make sure no distress, call in that sector ever went unanswered. He'd triggered it himself, 3 centuries back by his own ship's clock. When the convoy's drive failed and the cold started getting into places it shouldn't, he'd been talking to that relay chain every 6 hours since, reporting status, requesting extraction, following procedure, because procedure was the only thing he had left that still worked. I asked him if anyone had ever answered. He said no. He said the relay chain was gone, had probably been gone before his drive even failed, though there was no way for him to have known that from inside a dying ship with no working long-range sensors. The beacon kept transmitting, because beacons don't know when the people who built them have stopped existing. It just does the one job it was given, faithfully, into a silence that had swallowed the empire that asked for it before it ever swallowed him. He hadn't aimed it at me. He hadn't aimed it at anyone who could possibly have heard it. It had drifted off the old relay path sometime in the last 300 years. A tumbling hull pulls its own antenna array slightly out of true, century over century, until the cone of a signal meant for a fixed point starts sweeping a slow circle through space instead. And somewhere in that drift, it had swept across a freight lane nobody had charted when his empire built the chain. That was the whole of it. Bad luck, bent metal, and 300 years of patience aimed at people who didn't exist anymore, until it happened to cross paths with someone who did. I asked him how he'd kept the transmitter alive that long on a hull this far gone. He said it hadn't been hard, in the way a man says a thing wasn't hard when it had cost him almost everything else to manage it. He'd stripped power from every system that wasn't the beacon and the one loop of life support feeding his own compartment, decades back, Once he understood nobody was coming on any schedule he could plan around. He'd kept himself alive specifically so the transmission wouldn't go unattended. A beacon nobody tends drifts, and a drifting beacon stops being useful to whoever it's meant to reach. He'd kept faith with a duty roster that had quietly stopped existing somewhere behind him in time, and he'd done it so thoroughly I found myself unable to call it anything but discipline, not desperation. Discipline, run 3 centuries past the point where anyone was ever going to grade it. He told me this without much weight in it. Not bitterness. Not even particularly much grief, though I think the grief in him had worn down to something quieter than that, a long time before I opened his airlock. He told it to me the way you'd read a maintenance log. Date, fault, status, no resolution. I understood, listening to him, that I was the first new variable to enter his situation in longer than he could measure, and that he didn't entirely believe it yet. I checked what I could. The hull wouldn't hold a tow. I didn't need an engineer to tell me that. The groaning told me plenty on its own, and what little structural integrity remained wasn't going to survive being put under load. Life support was running on a single redundant loop that had been redundant for nobody but him for 300 years. There wasn't a version of this where I got that ship home. There was a version where I didn't leave him on it. I told him that. Not gently. I didn't have the right kind of gentle in me for a moment like that, and I don't think he'd have wanted it. I told him the hull was finished, and that I had a working shuttle and a working ship, and room enough for one more body that wasn't cargo. He looked at me for a long time, like he was running the math on whether this was a kindness he was allowed to accept from someone his beacon had never been meant to reach. He said his orders required him to remain with the convoy until relieved. I said the convoy had been relieved. Just 300 years and 1 freighter late. He didn't argue that. I don't think there was anything left in him to argue with. He let me get an arm under his shoulder, and the weight of him told me everything his voice hadn't. How little was actually left to carry. I got him through the corridor, through the airlock, into the shuttle, and I didn't look back at the command deck, because there wasn't anything back there I needed to see twice. He didn't make it to the depot. I want to be honest about that, because the niche has a habit of pretending these things end cleaner than they do. He made it 11 hours, most of it lucid, some of it not, long enough to tell me the names of the people who'd been on that convoy with him before the cold started taking them one at a time, long enough that I could write those names down somewhere they wouldn't just disappear a second time. He asked me, near the end, whether the relay chain had truly fallen before his drive failed, or after, whether there had been some window, however brief, in which his beacon might genuinely have reached someone who could have come. I told him I didn't know, because I didn't, and because I'd decided somewhere over those 11 hours that he'd earned an honest answer more than a comfortable one. He nodded, like that was the answer he'd expected all along, and didn't ask again. He died with the heat finally back in his hands. I'll take that. I filed the report the way you're supposed to. Full coordinates, full transcript. Recommendation that someone catalog the wreck before its orbit decays. Some clerk 3 departments over is going to read it and note, correctly, that the beacon was never meant for us, that nothing about its routing, its protocol, or its 300 years of faithful transmission had Earth's name anywhere on it. That's true. It wasn't ours to answer. I answered it anyway. Close enough, in the end, is the only kind of timing some signals are ever going to get. And I'd rather be the one who heard it late than the silence that almost got to keep him.